Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson. Tonight there is a verdict in that very depressing but also Byzantine and interesting murder trial in South Carolina tonight. We've got Judge Janine in a moment to take us through exactly what happened and what happens next.
What is being done on that?
Well, I want to take a step back for a second. While Congress was not able to deliver on the Policing Act, as you know, that was worked in the last session, the president took action. He took historic action to deal with an issue that was affecting communities. That has gotten support from civil rights leaders. That got support from police unions. The executive order that he put forward was incredibly important, as you know, and touted by many folks from both sides. So, want to make sure that is clear, that this was a historic action when Congress could not act. I don't have an update for you. Department of Justice would have more information. I know you just stated them. I just don't have anything to share for you at this time.
Let me follow up really quickly. At the beginning of the briefing, you talked about Eli Lilly slashing the insulin prices. Is there any conversation or pressure that the president is putting on Nordisk and Sanofi?
Look, the president used his bully pulpit to make himself very clear on how we should be putting the American people first. You heard him. One of the reasons we saw Eli Lilly take that action is because during the State of the Union, the president put out there that pharma companies need to make sure that they followed his lead as he helped sign and help tooth and nail get Inflation Reduction Act passed, and because of that, we saw a cap for seniors and for Medicare at $35, and the president said pharma companies should follow suit, and we saw that with Eli Lilly. So the bully pulpit that he speaks from very often and calls that out is a powerful tool that we believe has been very effective.
Thank you. I just want to seek to kind of understand the president's opposition to the bill a bit more and the reasons for it. One, is it just the lowering penalties for carjacking, or are there other aspects that he disagrees with? On carjackings too, is it broadly the message that would be sent by lowering the mandatory minimum? I'm looking at the bill, and basically right now the minimum sentence is 7 years with a maximum of 21, and the revisions would be 4 to 18. Does he believe that 7 years is the minimum sentence someone should receive for carjacking, or is it more so the message that would be sent here?
So I'm not going to go line by line of the legislation. What I can say more broadly, to your point, as you are asking me this question, is that the president wants to make sure that we have communities across the country feel safe. He feels that this is an incredibly important for him to do as president. This is something that is being presented to him. This is not a piece of legislation that he put forward. This is something that has been presented to him. He feels safe to take action on behalf of a community here, right here in D.C.
Maybe not line by line, but like just that line.
I just use carjacking as an example, but
he also mentioned it in his tweet.
I totally understand. I'm just not going to go line by line. It was just an easy example to give you all and the American people how he sees this. He wants to make sure that communities feel safe, and this is a way that he believes that we will see that.
On another area of criminal justice, the president during the campaign opposed the death penalty, said that he wanted to end it with a few exceptions as well. The number of people in death penalty has steadily gone up over the past couple years, including President Biden's time in office. Does he still support ending the death penalty? And also, just where does the administration go now to actually ensure that happens? As a follow to that, just also, what do you attribute the rise in people that have been, I said the death penalty. I am talking about solitary confinement, The number of people in solitary confinement has gone up in recent years while President Biden has been in office. He opposed solitary confinement during the campaign. What do you attribute the rise of people in solitary confinement during his time in office, and also what steps will he take going forward?
So not the death.
Not the death penalty.
Okay.
I was confused on that.
Okay.
Separate question.
Okay. His policy has not changed on this. Don't have anything to preview on how to move forward or the next steps. I cannot speak to why we've seen an uptick in this during his administration. Clearly, that's for experts to follow this, to speak to. I just don't have anything further to share. Okay. Go ahead, Karen.
Did the president talk to Mayor Bowser and tell her that he would sign this bill if it came to him, if the Senate passed it, before he would talk to Senate Democrats about this?
Yeah, I don't have any call to preview. We don't have a call to preview with Mayor Bowser. As you know, she's the mayor of D.C., so we have a close connection on this legislation to read out to you at this time. Okay.
So going back to Zolan's question, first question, if you're not going line by line, I guess my question is, what is it about this legislation specifically that is the president opposing, other than the broad concept of
I mean, that's the answer. The broad
about it does he feel like makes DC unsafe?
No, I understand. The broad concept of it is that he wants to make sure that communities feel safe, and he feels this is a step forward in doing that. And so, look, I use the carjacking as an example, just as a quick example so people can understand. I'm not going to go line by line. That's not something that we tend to do here, go line by line on every piece of legislation. We tend to lift up things that make sense, things that that can be easily understandable for the American people. So that's just an example that I used. But more broadly, this is a president who has led on making sure, putting forward historic plans to make sure that there's public safety is a priority, to make sure that law enforcement are able to, that we have law enforcement that go into communities and make sure communities feel safe. If you think about it, this is a president when he was senator, started the COPS program, right? That is another kind of apparatus that he put forward to make sure that communities felt safe. And that's what he's going to continue to do.
Is there something besides carjackings that make people feel unsafe about this specific piece of legislation?
What I can tell you is this is a piece of legislation that the mayor objected to. The D.C. Council moved forward with. But the president feels very strongly on this. He feels that we need to make sure that all communities, including D.C., the folks who live in D.C., feel safe, and he feels that taking this action does exactly that.
So the other thing I wanted to ask about was conceptually about statehood. There are all kinds of instances where legislatures override a governor's veto. They're at odds, but a law passes, and presumably the president doesn't feel like that imperils their statehood. Mm-hmm. What is it in this
and is going to take action on?
If they had statehood, then the council could pass this.
And that would be great, and that would be fine, right? Because the statehood would allow them to be the 51st state, and it would allow them to act as their own entity. And the president is continuing to fight for that. He's been calling for that for the past 20 years. They don't have that yet. So this is a piece of legislation that's being presented to him, and he's going to take action on behalf of the American people, including in D.C., on behalf of keeping the public safe, including in D.C., and that's what you're seeing the president do. But doesn't mean he's not going to call on making sure that D.C. is indeed a statehood. So this has been presented to him. He's going to take action on behalf of the American people, but of course he wants to make sure that D.C. does have statehood, as he's been calling for decades. Go ahead.
Thanks, Karine. I know you say you don't want to get ahead of the president's budget release next week, but does the president believe that there is reckless spending in the federal government that needs to be addressed?
So let me first say that this is a president for the first 2 years who has put policies forth that has lowered the deficit by $1.7 trillion. So he's taken that very seriously. to make sure that we continue to do that work. And he talked about it during the State of the Union. I just mentioned it, that he's going to cut the deficit by more than $2 trillion over 10 years by asking the wealthy and the big corporations to pay their share. And he's going to do that without cutting programs Americans have paid into. If you think about Social Security, think about Medicare, something that Republicans continue to say or have said for years now they want to cut. So the president's going to continue to fight for those important pieces of
that the ruling party, Georgian Dream, initiated and adopted actually a few hours ago at the first hearing in the Parliament of Georgia. So the initiator of this law, they're arguing that this is similar to U.S. law, FARA. So, what do you think this leaves the 30 plus years of building democracy in Georgia by the U.S.?
Well, this is something that we've spoken to over the past couple days. We've expressed our consistent concern about this. The law is still going through the process within the Georgian system, but nevertheless, we remain deeply troubled by the introduced foreign agents law. Precisely because it would stigmatize and silence independent voices and citizens of Georgia who are dedicated to building a better country for their fellow citizens, for their communities. We are deeply concerned about the potential implications of this law for freedom of speech and democracy in Georgia. Our point has been a simple one, and we've made this point in public, but we've also conveyed it in private. Anyone voting for this draft legislation would be responsible for potentially jeopardizing Georgia's Euro-Atlantic future. A law like this is not consistent with the aspirations that the Georgian people have expressed over the course of decades now. The future they have set out for themselves, and the future that we as the United States are determined to continue to be a partner to help them achieve. It's not just the United States expressing these reservations. Several other partner countries, the EU, the UN, and Georgian civil society groups have also issued strong statements of concern about this draft legislation. Now, there's been a lot of propaganda about this law. You mentioned one of these untruths, the idea that this law was based on our Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA. Our Foreign Agents Registration Act requires people who are agents of foreign governments to register as such. Our law does not affect NGO operations or funding sources. We can provide you with additional details on FARA if that would be of use. But FARA is very narrow. It is tailored to apply only to those agents of foreign governments. This is something very different, and that's why we're quite concerned about it.
Former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice and the Russia expert Fiona Hill the other day at the Brookings Institute event mentioned that U.S. attention to human rights record of Georgia and freedom of speech, etc., was not sufficient. How would you respond to that? Because for many years, especially in the past few years, Georgian civil society organizations, opposition leaders, and Western-oriented Georgians collectively, we are calling and urging the U.S. to impose sanctions against the oligarch Ivanishvili and his puppets in the government. And there is a growing concern that the state capture and growing authoritarianism and oligarchy is just booming in Georgia. So would you agree with Condoleezza Rice and Fiona Hill on that?
What I would say, and this has been a project of successive administrations, and that's why I think you are right to point to what Fiona Hill said, what former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has said as well. This has been a project of the people of Georgia, but also a partnership with the United States of America since Georgia's independence, going on decades now. From the beginning, we have stood in solidarity with our Georgian partners, and again, their own aspirations to be a free and sovereign country within its internationally recognized borders. We, of course, and you're alluding to this, have heard damaging rhetoric from some who may be opposed to those Euro-Atlantic aspirations that the Georgian people have put forward. We've spoken to this law as well. When we have seen that, when we have heard that, we have used our voice publicly. We've also used our voice privately. Ambassador Degnan and the team in Tbilisi have been deeply engaged, doing the work of this partnership with their Georgian counterparts, not only over the course of recent weeks, but over the course of some 30 years now. Because over the course of some 30 years, we have turned this partnership into a strategic one. It's an important one for us. We wish to continue to work together towards that shared vision of Georgia, fully integrated into the Euro-Atlantic family of nations, and part of a Europe that is whole, free, and at peace. Now, obviously, there are many challenges to that. Some within Georgia, some on the periphery of Georgia's border. But this is a vision that we know will take political will. It will take hard work. It will take resources to help realize. The United States is ready to continue to be a partner, and we hope to continue to find partners in the Georgian government.
Region, if you don't mind. Apologies for that. He mentioned those who are going to vote for this resolution will be responsible. Can you be a little bit more precise, particularly when it comes to talk about the elephant in the room? My colleague mentioned Mr. Ivanishvili. Will the United States government be willing to actually go after Ivanishvili and his party if they succeed in, let's say, sucking the oxygen from Georgia's democracy?
Alex, our focus right now is making very clear where the United States stands. We want there to be no doubt about the concerns that we've expressed, the concerns that the EU's expressed, the UN has expressed, a number of countries around the world have expressed, and probably most importantly of all, the concerns that the Georgian government should be hearing from civil society within their own country, from their own citizens. That's our focus. Of course, this passage of this law, implementation of this law would be great concern for us. We're not going to cross that bridge at this stage. It remains draft legislation that's under discussion by Georgian lawmakers. That's why we think at this stage the most important thing we can do is to leave no doubt about where we and the international community stands on this.
The single region, I know I've asked this before, but yesterday was the first month of new Caucasus negotiator who was just appointed to the region. Is it fair for us to expect his first trip anytime soon to the region?
You can expect that, in fact. The senior advisor for caucus negotiations, Louis Bono, is traveling to the region next week on his first trip in this role. This is the first of what we expect will be regular travel to all three countries of the South Caucasus. Mr. Bono plans to meet with senior leaders to support the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process and our sustained commitment to Georgia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. As I mentioned before, he will visit all three South Caucasus countries as part of his visit. He'll travel to Baku, to Yerevan, to Tbilisi as well in that order. This, we believe, will be an opportunity for Mr. Bono to build on the meeting between Secretary Blinken, Armenia's prime minister, and Azerbaijan's president at the Munich Security Conference a couple weeks ago now in mid-February. As we said at the conclusion of that trilateral engagement, we are encouraged by recent efforts by Armenia and Azerbaijan to engage productively on the peace process, and Mr. Bono hopes to be in a position to build on that effort and to see that progress continue. In all three of these cities, Mr. Bono will emphasize the United States is committed to promoting a peaceful, democratic, and prosperous future for the South Caucasus region. Jenny.
I had a couple questions on the Secretary's meeting with Lavrov this morning. Ned, what caused the Secretary to want to reach out to Lavrov at this point in time? Was there some development that led him to believe this would be a productive conversation? And the serious proposal he raised on Paul Whelan, how long has that been on the table? What can you tell us about it? And have the Russians engaged at all on it?
Sure. A couple things, Jenny, and you heard the Secretary speak to this. First, what this was not, as opposed to what it was. You heard from the Secretary this was a rather brief encounter with Foreign Minister Lavrov. This was not a bilateral meeting. This was not a protracted discussion between the two. This was a rather brief encounter that the Secretary took advantage of to convey clearly and directly messages that are important to the United States and, in many cases, to the rest of the world. The Secretary outlined those three messages. His first was on New START. And again, we've spoken extensively to this since the Russian Federation suspended its implementation of the New START treaty, because it's not only a concern for the United States as a responsible nuclear power, but it should be, and in fact is, a concern for the rest of the world, as the rest of the world expects Russia and the United States, just as we did with the Soviet Union during the course of the Cold War, to cooperate and to engage in talks on strategic stability and arms control. Second, you mentioned this, but the Secretary did raise, as he consistently has, the continued wrongful detention of U.S. citizen Paul Whelan. He noted that we had put a proposal on the table. He, again, encouraged Russia to accept it. And third, he underscored our continued commitment to Ukraine, including the proposals that we've heard from President Zelensky and his government for a just and durable peace, a peace that respects the UN Charter as well as the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. He stressed that Ukraine and the United States want this war to end. We want this war to end on that basis. No one wants this war to end more than Ukraine. We are standing right by Ukraine in our desire to see this war come to a close, and we are continuing to be ready to support that effort. But what continues to be missing is a similar determination from Moscow. The Secretary is not going to hesitate to convey clearly and directly messages that are important to us and that are important to the rest of the world. Of course, the continued detention of Paul Whelan is a concern to us. He's an American citizen. The practice of wrongful detention is a concern to the rest of the world. It is a concern to the rest of the world that Russia has purportedly suspended its implementation of the New START treaty. It's a concern to the rest of the world that Russia is waging a brutal, illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. And as we've heard from most of the G20, in fact, all except Russia and China, the G20 wants to see this war come to an end on a basis that's consistent with the new UN Charter and on a basis that is both just and durable. So the Secretary had an opportunity to convey these messages directly to Lavrov, and we thought it was important to do so. On the proposal for Paul Whelan, this is something that in all of our key engagements with Russian interlocutors we raise, and we impress upon them the need to see the release of Paul Whelan. He has been held for far too long, wrongfully detained. He should never have been held in the first place. We have, as we've said before, been relentless in our efforts to secure his release, just as we were relentless in our efforts to secure the release of Trevor Reed and Brittany Griner over the course of the past year. The proposal that the Secretary alluded to, this was not a proposal that the Russians heard for the first time today. This was a proposal that we have conveyed to them consistently in the past. What he did here today was, once again, a strong statement from the Secretary of State that Russia should accept this proposal, and in turn, it should release Paul Whelan.
Can you say, have the Russians engaged meaningfully with that proposal at all? Have they acknowledged it?
We have two overriding imperatives. Number one is to see the release of Paul Whelan, and to see more broadly the release of Americans who are wrongfully detained anywhere around the world. In the conduct of seeking that first imperative, we're not going to do or say anything that could jeopardize those efforts. So you can understand why we're going to continue to be circumspect in what we say publicly about this, but we have conveyed in some detail and all of the necessary detail to the Russian Federation the proposal that we have put on the table. We have gone about this relentlessly. We have gone about this creatively, seeking to do everything we can to see the release of Paul Whelan, and beyond Paul, Americans who are wrongfully detained anywhere around the world.
Can I just follow up on
Sure.
that? The Secretary had said that the day before he did not have any plans to meet Lavrov. I was just wondering, did the meeting happen at the request of the United States or at the request of the Russians?
I know our Russian colleagues are attempting to make some hay out of this. What is important for us to convey is that this was a brief encounter. This was not a protracted bilateral meeting or a protracted sit-down between the two of them. But more broadly, we make no apologies for clearly conveying what is in our interest. It is in our interest to see Russia resume full implementation of the New START treaty. It's in the interest of the rest of the world to see that as well. It's in our interest to see Paul Whelan return home just as soon as can be accomplished, and it's certainly in the interest of Ukraine, of the United States, of all of the countries around the world who believe in the UN Charter, to see the war in Ukraine, Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, come to an end on a basis that is both just and durable. The Russians may be trying to make some hay and to delve into some inside baseball or inside diplomacy. We are just not going to engage in that. What we want to make clear is precisely what the Secretary said, why he said it, and we make no apologies for that. Rather, we will continue to be relentless in raising these issues at every appropriate opportunity. Let me move around. Yes, go ahead, Julia.
Thank you. Senator Peter Welch, who just got back from Kodel to Israel, delivered a letter to President Biden today urging him to take action to help improve relations amid the violence in the West Bank. In the letter, he said, as far as the Netanyahu government is concerned, the two-state solution is dead, and is calling on the U.S. to acknowledge that, and is calling Biden to take a more active role in the region, saying we have a choice, stand by passively as a withered two-state approach recedes into oblivion, or do our best to re-energize it with more assertive efforts to persuade the Netanyahu government. What is your response to this letter? Do you think that the posture should change amid the tension in the West Bank? Do you think that Biden should be taking a more proactive approach?
A couple things on this. Number one, we continue to believe deeply, as do Israelis and Palestinians and people around the world, in a vision of a two-state solution, a negotiated two-state solution, a vision of two states for two peoples living side by side in peace and security. That is the vision that the United States has maintained over successive administrations. It is the vision that is consistent with Israel's identity as a Jewish and democratic state. It is a vision that is consistent with the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people to live in freedom, in a state of their own, and a state that is governed by their elected officials. There's no other formulation that we could envision accomplishing all of those goals. And all of those goals are important to us, but more importantly, they're important to Israelis and Palestinians. Now, on the question of engagement, I would note that we're hearing this within some 72 hours or so of senior American officials being on the ground with Israelis, with Palestinians, with Jordanians, with Egyptians. We're hearing this a couple weeks after the Secretary of State was in Israel was in the West Bank, was in Cairo. We're hearing this a month or so after the National Security Advisor was in Israel and the West Bank. We are deeply engaged in the region. We are deeply engaged with the parties. We have consistently made the point that the steps or so of senior American officials being on the ground with Israelis, with Palestinians, with Jordanians, with Egyptians. We're hearing this a couple weeks after the Secretary of State was in Israel, was in the West Bank, was in Cairo. We're hearing this a month or so after the National Security Advisor was in Israel and the West Bank. We are deeply engaged in the region. We are deeply engaged with the parties. We have consistently made the point that the steps on top of that. We have traveled to the region. Our Israeli partners have traveled here. I expect that will continue in the coming days, weeks, and months, but we just don't have any travel to preview at the moment. Yes?
Not sure if this is the same, actually two questions. First one, not sure if this is the same trip my colleague is referring to, but the finance minister, Smotrich, is reportedly planning to be in the U.S., I think, next week for an investment conference of some sort. Would the U.S., based on his sort of recent comments, consider revoking his visa, which is something that some groups here have been urging? And then sort of on a related question to something that was discussed earlier. There was a bill introduced earlier this week on the Hill to create an ambassador-level special envoy position for the Abraham Accords. Is that something the State Department is supportive of, thinks would be necessary, helpful?
So a couple of things. First, on potential travel here, we don't speak to individual visa records, nor as a general matter to a particular individual's eligibility for a U.S. visa. Nevertheless, we'll continue to make clear that we reject the comments from the minister, just as we did yesterday, and we appreciate the condemnations that we've heard from our Israeli partners. On the legislation you refer to, this is a project building bridges between Israel's Arab and Muslim majority neighbors, both near and far, that this administration has been a stalwart supporter of. We celebrated a notable anniversary of the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements here in this building last year. In our engagements with Arab and Muslim majority countries around the world, we consistently raise the possibility of improving relationships with Israel and improving relations with Israel, and in some cases, encouraging countries to pursue that path of normalization, something that we unambiguously support. This has high-level attention in this building. It has high-level attention in the White House. We're going to continue to do what we can as a partner to Israel, as a partner to
There was a call also by the Bret this morning, but there's no reference to the arrests or demonstrations that are happening there in Tunisia. And then also, there's apparently been contacts between the U.S. Embassy and opposition activists there, and the Tunisian Foreign Ministry gave a pretty strong rebuke saying not to interfere in internal affairs. Can you confirm those contacts, and can you comment on that statement?
So first, to your broader question, Leon, we've spoken of our concerns to what has been happening in Tunisia in recent months. We spoke to it last month, I believe. We expressed our concern by the reported arrests of multiple political figures, business leaders, and journalists. We've expressed that concern precisely because we in the world have seen over the course of years now the aspirations of the Tunisian people for greater levels of democracy, for an independent and transparent judiciary, and one that is able to protect fundamental freedoms for all the people of Tunisia. We've engaged with the Tunisian government at all levels in support of human rights and freedom of expression. These are not values that we support only in a place like Tunisia, but these are universal rights that we seek to defend and to promote anywhere